My great fellow Americans, earlier today, on the eve of the Thanksgiving holiday, two members of the National Guard serving in Washington, D.C., were shot at point-blank range in a monstrous ambush-style attack just steps away from the White House. They had been deputized as part of the most successful public safety and national security mission in the history of our nation's capital, the D.C. Safe and Beautiful Task Force, which has achieved an unprecedented reduction in violent crime and crimes of all type. This heinous assault was an act of evil, an act of hatred, and an act of terror. It was a crime against our entire nation. It was a crime against humanity. The hearts of all Americans tonight are with those two members of the West Virginia National Guard and their families. The love of our entire country is pouring out for them, and we are lifting them up in our prayers. As we are filled with anguish and grief for those who were shot, we're also filled with righteous anger and ferocious resolve. As President of the United States, I am determined to ensure that the animal who perpetrated this atrocity pays the steepest possible price. I can report tonight that based on the best available information, the Department of Homeland Security is confident that the suspect in custody is a foreigner who entered our country from Afghanistan. We're not going to put up with these kind of assaults on law and order by people who shouldn't even be in our country. We must now re-examine every single alien who has entered our country from Afghanistan under Biden, and we must take all necessary measures to ensure the removal of any alien from any country who does not belong here or add benefit to our country. If they can't love our country, we don't want them. America will never bend and never yield in the face of terror. And at the same time, we will not be deterred from the mission these service members were so nobly fulfilling. That is why tonight I can announce that I have directed the Department of War to mobilize an additional 500 troops to help protect our capital city. We will make America totally safe again, and we will bring the perpetrator of this barbaric attack to swift and certain justice if the bullets going in the opposite direction haven't already done that. During this time of the year, when we gather at home with loved ones, these two patriots were wearing the uniform of our country, patrolling the streets of our capital. They had taken a selfless oath to defend our nation against all enemies, foreign and domestic, and that is exactly what they were doing when they were gunned down in a savage attack. I want to express my extraordinary gratitude to every member of the United States military who is deployed tonight, at home and abroad. I also want to thank the Secret Service and the D.C. Metropolitan Police Department for their work today. This Thanksgiving, I ask every family to say a prayer for the two great heroes who were so horribly shot, and for their loved ones. Please say a prayer. May God bless them and comfort them, and may God bless and protect the United States of America. Thank you and good night.
This morning, two National Guard members are in critical condition after they were shot while on duty just blocks from the White House. Authorities say the suspect, identified as 29-year-old Rahmanullah Lakanwal, allegedly tracked the guardsmen before opening fire. ABC photographer Chris Plater was nearby and heard the gunshots.
One National Guard was lying on his side. Then I looked at the other National Guard member that was down, and I saw compressions going on.
There was countless personnel around him, and they put him in a truck, and a minute later they were gone.
The gunshots erupting Wednesday afternoon near the Farragut West Metro Station, where the National Guardsman was on patrol. Authorities say he was then shot by other Guards members and taken into custody critically injured.
The reason that this suspect is in custody is because of the bravery of the men and women of the National Guard who responded due to their extensive training to secure American lives today.
Just blocks from the White House, a man stepped out of his vehicle and opened fire on two young soldiers standing guard over America's capital. The shooter wasn't a stranger to America's military. He had once fought alongside U.S. Special Forces in the mountains of Afghanistan. But on this day, Rahmanullah Lakanwal, a 29-year-old Afghan national granted asylum just months earlier, became the perpetrator of what the FBI would call a targeted act of terrorism. What drove a former ally to drive 3,000 miles across the country to execute an ambush on the very people who once stood beside him in battle. Subscribe to True Crime Lures as we uncover the devastating truth behind the Washington, D.C. National Guard shooting. Sarah Beckstrom was 20 years old when she raised her right hand to join the West Virginia National Guard. Born and raised in the Mountain State, Sarah represented everything hopeful about young Americans choosing to serve their country. She had enlisted with a clear sense of purpose, drawn to the Guard's unique mission of protecting both her home state and the nation at large. Those who knew Sarah described her as determined and focused, someone who set goals and achieved them with quiet confidence. She wasn't the type to seek attention or recognition. Instead, she let her actions speak for themselves. Her decision to join the National Guard reflected a deep-rooted belief in service over self, a value instilled in her from childhood. Her commanders had high expectations for her future in the Guard, seeing in her the potential for advancement through the ranks. She had completed her basic training and advanced individual training with strong evaluations from her instructors, who noted her ability to remain calm under pressure and her natural leadership qualities. Outside of her military commitments, Sarah maintained close relationships with her family back in West Virginia. She called home regularly, sharing stories about her training experiences and her excitement about finally beginning her active service. Her parents had attended her graduation from basic training, beaming with pride as they watched their daughter transform from a civilian into a soldier. Sarah had specific aspirations for her time in the Guard. She was interested in eventually pursuing specialized training that would allow her to serve in more technical roles. She had researched various military occupational specialties and was already planning her next steps in her military education. Her NCOs had encouraged these ambitions, recognizing that soldiers with Sarah's drive and dedication formed the backbone of the Guard's mission. The most devastating aspect of Sarah's story is its timing. She had been formally sworn in as part of her unit's deployment to Washington, D.C. less than 24 hours before the shooting. This was her first operational assignment following all her training. She had arrived in the capital filled with pride about serving at such a significant location, never imagining that her first day of real service would become her last conscious moments in uniform. Sarah's personality was marked by a quiet professionalism that belied her young age. She took her responsibilities seriously, arriving early and staying late when necessary. Her fellow guardsmen appreciated her reliability and her willingness to help others, even when exhausted from training. She had quickly earned respect within her unit, not through bravado, but through consistent, solid performance. Andrew Wolfe was 24 years old and had already established himself as a respected non-commissioned officer in the West Virginia National Guard. Unlike Sarah, who was just beginning her journey, Andrew had several years of military experience under his belt. He wore the rank of Staff Sergeant, a position that carried significant responsibility for training and leading junior enlisted soldiers. Andrew's path to the National Guard had been deliberate and thoughtful. He had joined after carefully considering his options, attracted by the Guard's dual mission and the opportunity to serve while maintaining connections to his civilian community. His decision proved to be the right one. He excelled in the military environment, quickly distinguishing himself through hard work and tactical proficiency. As a staff sergeant, Andrew held a leadership position that required him to balance multiple responsibilities. He was responsible for the welfare, training, and discipline of the soldiers in his charge. His peers and superiors regarded him as someone who led by example, never asking his troops to do anything he wouldn't do himself. This leadership philosophy earned him genuine loyalty from those who served under him. Andrew's military record reflected consistent excellence. He had completed multiple training courses beyond his basic requirements, constantly seeking to improve his skills and knowledge. He held certifications in various tactical and technical areas that made him a valuable asset to his unit. His personnel file contained numerous commendations from superior officers who recognized his potential for continued advancement. Outside of his military role, Andrew was known for his sense of humor and ability to lift morale during difficult training exercises. He understood that leadership wasn't just about barking orders. It was about understanding the human element, knowing when to push and when to provide encouragement. His soldiers appreciated this balanced approach, which made them more effective as a team. Andrew had been looking forward to this capital assignment as both a professional opportunity and a personal honor. For an NCO, leading soldiers during a real-world mission in the nation's capital represented a significant responsibility. He had prepared meticulously for the deployment, ensuring his troops understood their duties and responsibilities. He took particular care to mentor the newer guardsmen like Sarah. Understanding that this would be their first taste of operational service, his commitment to his soldiers' welfare was absolute. Andrew believed that an NCO's primary duty was ensuring that every soldier under their command returned home safely. He had briefed his team extensively on safety protocols and situational awareness. The irony that he couldn't protect them or himself from what was about to happen would haunt everyone who knew him. Andrew's family had supported his military service from the beginning, though they naturally worried about his safety. However, they had taken comfort in the fact that his guard service kept him largely domestic, unlike active duty deployments to combat zones overseas. The notion that he would be shot down in America's capital, just yards from the White House, was beyond anything they had ever imagined as a possibility. Rahmanullah Lakanwal had spent a decade wearing a military uniform in Afghanistan before ever setting foot in America. For 10 years, he served in the Afghan army, working so closely with U.S. Special Forces that American soldiers knew him by name. His unit operated in southern Afghanistan, one of the most dangerous regions in the country, where Taliban influence remained strong, and combat operations were frequent and intense. Lakanwal wasn't just any Afghan soldier. He commanded his own unit of Afghan Special Forces personnel. According to former comrades, he led elite troops who partnered with both American and British forces on high-risk missions. This wasn't the kind of position given to someone unreliable or untrustworthy. It required competence, courage, and the ability to work seamlessly with Western military partners who depended on him in life-or-death situations. His work with the CIA represented an even deeper level of trust and integration with American operations. As part of a CIA partner force based in Kandahar, Lakanwal participated in some of the most sensitive and dangerous operations in the region. The CIA doesn't recruit local partners carelessly. They undergo extensive vetting and must prove their reliability repeatedly. Lakanwal had apparently passed every test, earning the confidence of American intelligence operatives who trusted him with classified operations. When the United States began its chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan in August 2021, Lakanwal faced the same terrifying reality as thousands of other Afghan allies. The Taliban was returning to power, and anyone who had worked with Americans was now marked for death. The Taliban had long memories and executed former collaborators without mercy. For Lakanwal and his family, a wife and 5 children, staying in Afghanistan meant almost certain death. On September 8, 2021, Lakanwal and his family arrived in the United States through Operation Allies Welcome, the emergency program created to evacuate Afghan nationals who had assisted American forces. He was among approximately 80,000 Afghans brought to America during this period, part of a massive humanitarian operation conducted under extraordinary time pressure as the Taliban closed in on Kabul. Lakanwal settled his family in Bellingham, Washington, a mid-sized city in the northwestern corner of the state, near the Canadian border. It was about as far from Afghanistan, both geographically and culturally, as one could get. The family had to rebuild their entire lives from scratch in a completely foreign country. Despite these challenges, Lakanwal found employment with Amazon and Amazon Flex, working in the logistics and delivery sectors to support his wife and 5 children. In 2024, Lakanwal formally applied for asylum in the United States. Although he had been allowed into the country under emergency evacuation protocols, asylum would provide permanent legal protection and a path toward eventual citizenship. His application detailed his service alongside American forces and the danger he faced from Taliban retaliation. The application process took months of documentation, interviews, and background checks. In April 2025, the Trump administration granted Lakanwal's asylum request. This wasn't a rubber stamp approval. Asylum applications undergo rigorous scrutiny, especially for individuals from high-risk countries. The approval meant that multiple federal agencies, including the Department of Homeland Security, had reviewed his background and determined he didn't pose a security threat. It meant America was officially recognizing its obligation to protect someone who had risked everything to help American forces. But something was happening beneath the surface that no background check had detected. According to people who knew him, Lakanwal had been deeply affected by the death of a close friend in 2024. This friend was also a former Afghan commander who had fought alongside Americans and had desperately sought asylum in the United States. Unlike Lakanwal, this friend's application had been denied or delayed. The friend died, circumstances unclear, while still trying to escape the consequences of having helped America. For Lakanwal, this represented a betrayal that apparently festered into something dark and violent. In the weeks before the shooting, Lakanwal made a decision that would destroy multiple lives. He left his family in Bellingham and began driving eastward across the United States. This wasn't an impulsive road trip. It was a 3,000-mile journey that required days of driving, countless hours alone with his thoughts, and numerous opportunities to turn back. He didn't turn back. He drove through Washington State, across Idaho and Montana, through the Great Plains, across the Midwest, and finally into the District of Columbia. What was going through his mind during those thousands of miles? Was he thinking about his friend who died? About Afghanistan falling to the Taliban? About perceived betrayals and broken promises? Or had he moved beyond rational thought into something darker? A place where violence against Americans in uniform seemed like justice rather than murder? Lakanwal arrived in Washington, D.C. with a .357 Smith & Wesson revolver and a plan. Wednesday, November 26th, 2025 started as a routine day for the National Guard personnel deployed to protect the nation's capital. The weather was cold but clear, typical for late November in D.C. At approximately 2:15 in the afternoon, Specialist Sarah Beckstrom and Staff Sergeant Andrew Wolfe were at their assigned post near the White House. The exact location was within blocks of America's most famous residence, an area that should have been among the safest places in the country. They were in uniform, clearly identifiable as military personnel, standing as visible symbols of security and order. Rahmanullah Lakanwal approached in his vehicle. What happened next occurred with shocking speed and brutality. This wasn't a confrontation or an argument that escalated. This was an ambush, a pre-planned execution carried out with military precision by someone who knew exactly how to kill. Lakanwal exited his vehicle and immediately opened fire with his .357 revolver. The first shots struck one of the guardsmen, and they went down instantly. But Lakanwal didn't stop there. In an act that revealed the calculated nature of his attack, he walked closer to the fallen guardsman and fired again at point-blank range, ensuring maximum damage. The shooter had learned from a decade of combat. He knew how to confirm a kill. Then he turned his weapon toward the second guardsman. Multiple shots rang out in rapid succession. The .357 revolver is not a subtle weapon. Each shot would have echoed off the buildings surrounding the area, creating a cacophony of violence in one of America's most protected zones. The entire attack lasted only seconds, but in those seconds, two young people who had committed themselves to serving their country were shot down like animals in a deliberate act of violence. They hadn't been given any chance to defend themselves, to draw their own weapons, or even to understand what was happening. They were simply standing at their post one moment and fighting for their lives the next. But Lakanwal had miscalculated one crucial factor. He wasn't ambushing isolated, helpless targets. Other National Guard members were nearby, and they responded with the training and courage their service demanded. Within moments of the shooting beginning, these guardsmen were moving toward the threat, their own weapons drawn. One of the responding guardsmen shot Lakanwal, wounding him and ending his attack. Other Guard members physically subdued the shooter, preventing him from firing any more shots or attempting to flee. The speed and effectiveness of their response likely prevented additional casualties. Lakanwal had more ammunition and could have continued his rampage if not stopped. The scene quickly filled with emergency responders. Both wounded guardsmen were critically injured and required immediate medical intervention. Paramedics worked frantically to stabilize them at the scene before rushing them to nearby hospitals. The severity of their injuries meant that every second counted in the race to save their lives. Lakanwal, also wounded from the guardsman's defensive shot, received medical treatment as well, though he was immediately placed under armed guard. Despite bleeding from his own gunshot wound, he was now a prisoner, facing the possibility of spending the rest of his life in prison or facing execution for what he had just done. The area around the shooting was immediately locked down. Law enforcement from multiple agencies flooded the scene. D.C. Metropolitan Police, FBI, Secret Service, military police, and others. Streets were closed, witnesses were identified and interviewed, and evidence collection began. Spent shell casings, blood evidence, the shooter's weapon, and countless other pieces of physical evidence were photographed, cataloged, and collected. News of the shooting spread rapidly through official channels and social media. Within an hour, the entire country knew that two National Guardsmen had been shot in an ambush attack near the White House. The fact that the shooter was an Afghan national who had been granted asylum sparked immediate political controversy and raised urgent questions about vetting procedures and national security. Both Sarah Beckstrom and Andrew Wolfe were rushed into emergency surgery. The bullets from Lakanwal's .357 revolver had caused devastating internal injuries. Surgeons worked for hours trying to repair the damage. But even after surgery, both guardsmen remained in critical condition. Their families were notified and rushed to D.C. to be at their bedsides, facing the possibility that their loved ones might not survive. The FBI took the lead in investigating the shooting, recognizing immediately that this was potentially an act of terrorism rather than a simple assault. FBI Director Kash Patel personally took charge of the case, signaling its national importance and complexity.
Make no mistake, they will be brought to justice. Since this is an assault on a federal law enforcement officer, this will be treated at the federal level as an assault on a federal law enforcement officer.
The Bureau mobilized massive resources, understanding that this investigation needed to answer not just what happened, but why, and whether there were any additional threats. The first priority was securing and processing the crime scene. FBI forensic teams spent hours documenting every detail of the location where the shooting occurred. They mapped the positions of the shooter, the victims, and the responding guardsmen. They collected the spent shell casings from Lakanwal's revolver and matched them to the weapon. They documented blood spatter patterns, bullet trajectories, and sightlines. Every piece of physical evidence needed to be preserved for eventual prosecution. The second immediate priority was conducting a comprehensive threat assessment. Was Lakanwal acting alone? Or was this part of a larger plot? Did he have accomplices waiting to conduct additional attacks? Were other Guard members, military installations, or government facilities at risk? The FBI couldn't assume this was an isolated incident until they had thoroughly investigated every possibility. Within hours of the shooting, FBI agents obtained and executed a search warrant for Lakanwal's residence in Bellingham, Washington. A team of agents descended on his home, surprising his family and beginning a methodical search of the entire property. They were looking for anything that might explain his motives or reveal co-conspirators, documents, writings, weapons, communications with others, or materials indicating planning and preparation. The search of Lakanwal's home yielded a treasure trove of digital evidence. Agents seized multiple cell phones, laptop computers, tablet devices, and iPads. In the modern era, these electronic devices contain more information about a person's thoughts, plans, and connections than any physical diary or address book ever could. Everything from text messages and emails to internet search histories and social media activity could provide crucial insights into what drove Lakanwal to commit this attack. FBI cyber forensic specialists began the painstaking process of extracting and analyzing data from these devices. They looked for communications with potential accomplices or radicalized individuals. They examined his internet search history to see if he had researched the guard deployment, planned his route, or sought information about weapons and tactics. They recovered deleted files and messages that Lakanwal thought were gone forever. Every digital footprint he had left was being methodically traced and documented. Simultaneously, the FBI began interviewing everyone who had contact with Lakanwal in the period leading up to the attack. Co-workers at Amazon were questioned about his behavior, mood, and any statements he might have made. Neighbors were asked whether they noticed anything unusual in the days or weeks before he left on his cross-country drive. The FBI cast a wide net, understanding that seemingly insignificant details might prove crucial to understanding his transformation. The Bureau also coordinated with the Department of Defense and the CIA to obtain records of Lakanwal's service in Afghanistan. Agents reviewed his history, looking for any previous red flags or concerning incidents. They interviewed American military personnel and intelligence officers who had worked directly with him during his time as a partner force member. Had there been warning signs that were missed or dismissed? Had his behavior during his Afghanistan service indicated potential for violence? FBI investigators tracked Lakanwal's movements during his cross-country drive from Washington state to D.C. They obtained surveillance footage from gas stations, rest stops, and traffic cameras along his route. They pulled his credit card and debit card records to see where he stopped and what he purchased. They examined his cell phone's location data to map his exact route and timeline. This wasn't just about understanding how he got to D.C. It was about determining whether he met with anyone along the way or took actions that indicated co-conspirators. The investigation expanded internationally as well. The FBI worked with Afghan sources and allied intelligence services to learn more about Lakanwal's background and connections. They investigated whether he had maintained contact with individuals in Afghanistan or Pakistan who might have encouraged or directed his attack. They looked into whether he had any connections to Taliban members, ISIS-K, or other terrorist organizations. The possibility that this was a directed attack rather than a lone wolf operation had to be thoroughly explored. Agents conducted extensive interviews with members of the Afghan refugee and immigrant community in the Bellingham area. They wanted to understand Lakanwal's integration into American society, his relationships within the Afghan community, and whether he had expressed extremist views or grievances against the United States. These interviews had to be conducted sensitively. The vast majority of Afghan refugees and asylum seekers posed no threat whatsoever, and the FBI didn't want to create an atmosphere of suspicion and fear within that community. The FBI also examined Lakanwal's asylum application and reviewed the vetting process he underwent. The goal wasn't to assign blame for missing warning signs, but to understand whether current vetting procedures were adequate or needed to be enhanced. If Lakanwal had successfully concealed dangerous intentions, How could the system be improved to detect similar cases in the future? Director Patel characterized the investigation as coast to coast, reflecting its enormous scope. The FBI was simultaneously working crime scenes in D.C. and Washington state, conducting interviews across multiple states, coordinating with international partners, and analyzing massive amounts of digital evidence. Hundreds of agents and analysts were involved, all working under intense time pressure to provide answers to a shocked nation. Investigators focused heavily on the catalyst for his violence, the death of a close former comrade in 2024, whose failed asylum application solidified Lakanwal's sense of abandonment and betrayal. The FBI explored whether this personal tragedy had been the turning point that transformed him from a former ally into someone capable of murdering American soldiers. Investigators had to determine whether Lakanwal specifically targeted the National Guard or whether he would have attacked any available military or government personnel. The fact that he drove 3,000 miles to Washington, D.C. suggested that the location and the symbolic nature of attacking near the White House were important to him. The fact that he attacked National Guard members, part-time citizen soldiers, rather than active-duty military, raised questions about whether he understood the distinction or cared. The FBI worked closely with U.S. Attorney Jeanine Pirro's office throughout the investigation, ensuring that evidence was collected and documented in ways that would hold up in court. Federal prosecutors need airtight cases, especially in high-profile terrorism prosecutions that might eventually involve capital punishment. Every piece of evidence had to be obtained legally, with proper warrants and procedures followed meticulously. Any mistakes could jeopardize the prosecution. On Thursday, November 27, 2025, the day after the shooting and Thanksgiving Day, FBI Director Kash Patel and U.S. Attorney Jeanine Pirro stood before a packed room of journalists, camera crews, and government officials to provide the nation with its first official briefing on the attack. The decision to hold the press conference on Thanksgiving was unusual but necessary. The country demanded answers, and waiting wasn't an option. Director Patel spoke first, his tone grave and measured. He provided a detailed timeline of the attack itself, walking through what investigators had determined occurred at 2:15 p.m. the previous day. He described how Lakanwal had exited his vehicle and immediately opened fire in an ambush-style attack, shooting the first guardsman and then approaching to fire again at close range before turning his weapon on the second victim. Patel's description was clinical but powerful, painting a picture of calculated violence that shocked even seasoned law enforcement officials. Patel revealed that the FBI was formally investigating the shooting as an act of terrorism. This designation was significant. It meant the Bureau believed Lakanwal's attack was motivated by political or ideological goals rather than personal grievance alone. It meant the full resources of the FBI's counterterrorism division were engaged, and it opened the door to specific federal terrorism charges that carried severe penalties, including potential capital punishment. The FBI director outlined the scope of the ongoing investigation, which he characterized as a coast-to-coast operation. He explained that agents had executed search warrants at Lakanwal's residence in Washington state and had seized numerous electronic devices, including multiple cell phones, laptop computers, and tablets. He emphasized that FBI cyber forensic experts were currently analyzing these devices for any evidence of communications with co-conspirators, radical ideological content, or planning documents related to the attack. Patel confirmed that Rahmanullah Lakanwal was a 29-year-old Afghan national who had entered the United States in September 2021 through Operation Allies Welcome. He stated that the FBI had received official confirmation from both the Department of Defense and the CIA that Lakanwal had previously worked with American forces in Afghanistan as part of a partner force. Patel was careful in his wording. He didn't minimize Lakanwal's past service, but he also made clear that this history made his attack even more troubling and incomprehensible. The director acknowledged that a central question was how someone with direct ties to American military and intelligence operations had managed to pass vetting and gain asylum, only to later attack the very soldiers whose predecessors he once fought beside. He stated that the FBI was conducting a thorough review of the failed vetting process and promised that if systemic failures were identified, they would be addressed. Patel emphasized that the investigation remained active and ongoing. He urged anyone with information about Lakanwal, his activities before the attack, or possible connections to other individuals to contact the FBI immediately. He assured the public that hundreds of agents were working around the clock to ensure a complete understanding of how and why this attack occurred and whether any additional threats existed. When U.S. Attorney Janine Pirro stepped to the microphone, her prosecutorial background was immediately evident. While Patel had focused on the investigative aspects, Pirro spoke about justice, accountability, and the legal process that would unfold. Her remarks were aimed not just at informing the public, but at sending a message to anyone who might consider similar violence. The United States government would pursue the maximum possible penalties. Pirro announced the initial federal charges being filed against Lakanwal. The criminal complaint included 3 counts of assault with intent to kill while armed, reflecting the attacks on both guardsmen and the fact that he had fired multiple shots at one of the victims. Additionally, he faced a charge of possession of a firearm during a crime of violence, a federal offense that carried mandatory minimum sentences and could run consecutively to any other sentences imposed. But Pirro made clear these initial charges were just the beginning. She stated explicitly that the charges could and likely would change depending on the medical conditions of Specialists Sarah Beckstrom and Staff Sergeant Andrew Wolfe. Both guardsmen remained in critical condition following surgery, and their prognoses remained uncertain. If either or both of the victims died from their injuries, Pirro stated without hesitation that Lakanwal would be charged with first-degree murder under federal law. The U.S. Attorney revealed a particularly heartbreaking detail that underscored the tragedy. Both victims had been sworn into their service less than 24 hours before they were shot. The timing added an extra layer of cruelty to an already brutal attack. Pirro's voice took on a harder edge when discussing potential punishment. She referenced conversations with Attorney General Pam Bondi and stated unequivocally that the Justice Department would seek the death penalty if the victims died from their injuries. This wasn't a casual mention or a possibility left open. It was a definitive statement of prosecutorial intent. Pirro used strong language, referring to Lakanwal as a monster who had betrayed the country that gave him sanctuary and murdered the soldiers who represented America's protection of its allies. Pirro also addressed the political dimensions of the case that were already generating heated debate across the country. She pushed back against any attempt to use this tragedy to demonize all Afghan refugees or asylum seekers. She noted that tens of thousands of Afghans had been evacuated to the United States, and the vast majority had integrated peacefully and posed no threat whatsoever. She emphasized that Lakanwal's actions represented an isolated act of treachery, not just against America, but against his fellow Afghan refugees who were now at risk of facing increased scrutiny and prejudice because of his violence. At the same time, Pirro didn't shy away from discussing the failure that had allowed Lakanwal to be granted asylum, despite whatever darkness was growing inside him. She stated that the Justice Department and Department of Homeland Security were jointly reviewing the case to determine whether red flags had been missed or whether current vetting procedures needed to be enhanced. She acknowledged that while no system could be perfect, the government owed it to the American people to learn from this tragedy and prevent similar cases in the future. The U.S. Attorney provided information about the weapon used in the attack, a .357 Smith & Wesson revolver, a powerful handgun capable of inflicting catastrophic injuries. She didn't elaborate on where or how Lakanwal had obtained the weapon, though that was certainly part of the ongoing investigation. When reporters asked about Lakanwal's potential defense, Pirro shut down speculation quickly. She stated that regardless of whatever grievances or psychological issues the defense might raise, nothing could justify or excuse what he had done. He had made a conscious choice to drive across the country, obtain a weapon, locate National Guard members, and open fire on them without warning. These were the actions of someone who planned and executed an attack, not someone acting in a moment of mental crisis. Both Patel and Pirro took questions from the assembled media, though they were careful not to reveal information that might compromise the ongoing investigation. When asked about possible connections to terrorist organizations, Patel stated that the FBI was exploring all possibilities, but had not yet established any direct links. When asked whether Lakanwal had expressed anti-American sentiment before the attack, Pirro said that investigators were interviewing numerous people who knew him and were developing a fuller picture of his mindset in the months before the shooting. The press conference lasted approximately 45 minutes, with both officials remaining until all questions had been addressed. The mood was somber. There was none of the triumphalism that sometimes accompanies announcements of major arrests or disrupted plots. This was a tragedy that had already occurred, and two young Americans were fighting for their lives in hospital rooms nearby. The officials' grave demeanor reflected the seriousness of the situation and the sadness of the circumstances. Before concluding, Pirro made a direct appeal to the public. She asked Americans to keep Specialist Beckstrom and Staff Sergeant Wolfe in their thoughts and prayers. She acknowledged that both families had rushed to Washington to be with their loved ones and were going through unimaginable pain and uncertainty. She noted that these young people had volunteered to serve their country, had been placed in harm's way to protect the nation's capital, and deserved the gratitude and support of every American. Following the press conference, the federal criminal justice system began moving forward with the prosecution of Rahmanullah Lakanwal. Despite his own gunshot wound sustained during the attack, he was released from medical care after treatment and immediately transferred to federal custody. He was transported to a secure detention facility where he would be held pending trial, with no possibility of bail given the severity of the charges and the overwhelming evidence of his guilt. Lakanwal's first appearance in federal court occurred within 72 hours of the shooting, as required by law. He appeared before a federal magistrate judge in a preliminary hearing where the charges against him were formally read, and he was informed of his constitutional rights. He was appointed a federal public defender as he lacked the financial resources to hire private counsel. The public defender would face the unenviable task of defending a client whose crime had been witnessed by multiple people, captured on security footage, and followed by an immediate arrest at the scene. The preliminary hearing was brief and procedural. Lakanwal, still recovering from his gunshot wound, said little beyond confirming his identity and indicating he understood the charges against him. The magistrate judge ordered him held without bond pending trial, finding that he posed both a flight risk and a danger to the community. The defense didn't even argue for bail. It would have been a futile gesture given the circumstances. Attorney General Pam Bondi personally authorized the death penalty designation for the case, fulfilling the promise made during the press conference should the victims succumb to their injuries. The death penalty authorization triggered bifurcated trial procedures, a guilt phase followed by a separate sentencing phase if he were convicted. During the sentencing phase, the jury would hear aggravating factors supporting death, such as the premeditated nature of the attack and the vulnerability of the victims, and mitigating factors arguing for life imprisonment, such as his past service with American forces or any mental health issues. The jury would need to unanimously agree that death was the appropriate punishment. Otherwise, he would receive life imprisonment without possibility of parole. Lakanwal's defense team would face extraordinary challenges in mounting any meaningful defense. The evidence against their client was overwhelming. Multiple eyewitnesses, security camera footage, ballistic evidence matching his weapon to the bullets recovered from the victims, and his immediate apprehension at the scene. The defense couldn't credibly argue mistaken identity or that someone else committed the crime. Their only realistic options were to argue for lesser charges, which seemed unlikely given the clear premeditation, or to focus on avoiding the death penalty during the sentencing phase. The prosecution began building its case with meticulous attention to detail. Assistant U.S. attorneys compiled witness lists that included the other National Guard members who witnessed the attack and subdued Lakanwal, the first responders who treated the victims, the surgeons who operated on them, and the FBI agents who conducted the investigation. They organized the physical evidence recovered from the crime scene and from the search of Lakanwal's residence. They prepared to introduce the digital evidence extracted from his electronic devices, which would help establish premeditation and planning. One of the prosecution's key challenges would be establishing motive, not because it was legally required for conviction, but because juries want to understand why something so terrible happened. Prosecutors prepared to introduce evidence about Lakanwal's friend, who had died after being unable to secure asylum, arguing that this personal tragedy had transformed grief into rage against the United States and its military. They would present evidence of his cross-country drive as a proof of planning and determination. They would argue that his military background made him particularly dangerous because he knew exactly how to execute an effective ambush. The defense team, meanwhile, would try to humanize their client and potentially argue for some form of diminished capacity. They would likely highlight his decade of service alongside American forces in Afghanistan, presenting him as someone who had risked his life fighting the Taliban and protecting American personnel. They might argue that the trauma of war, combined with the grief over his friend's death and the difficulties of adjusting to life in America, had created a psychological break that diminished his culpability. This wouldn't be a not guilty by reason of insanity defense, which is almost never successful in federal court, but rather an attempt to mitigate his sentence. Federal prosecutors formally requested that the trial be expedited given the public interest in the case and the clear nature of the evidence. The defense predictably argued for more time to prepare, citing the complexity of a potential death penalty case and the need to conduct their own investigation into Lakanwal's background and mental state. The district judge assigned to the case would ultimately have to balance these competing interests, though federal speedy trial requirements meant the case would move forward much faster than a typical state prosecution. Pretrial motions began flooding into the court. The defense filed motions to suppress certain evidence, arguing that the search of Lakanwal's residence in Washington had exceeded the scope of the warrant. Prosecutors filed motions in limine seeking to exclude any defense arguments that suggested the victims somehow shared responsibility for their own shooting or that American foreign policy in Afghanistan justified the attack. The judge would need to rule on dozens of such motions before trial could begin. The prosecution also had to navigate victim impact considerations. The families of Beckstrom and Wolfe had rights under the Crime Victims' Rights Act to be informed of proceedings, to be present at court hearings, and to be heard during sentencing. Victim witness coordinators from the U.S. Attorney's Office maintained regular contact with the families, keeping them informed of developments and helping them understand the legal process. If the case went to trial, family members would likely testify during the sentencing phase about the devastating impact of the shooting on their lives. Security surrounding the case remained extraordinarily tight. Lakanwal was transported to and from court proceedings in heavy security, with armed marshals surrounding him at all times. The courthouse itself implemented enhanced security measures for hearings related to the case, including metal detectors, bag searches, and restrictions on who could enter the courtroom. The government wasn't taking any chances that supporters, if he had any, might attempt to free him, or that he might be targeted by vigilantes seeking their own form of justice. Media coverage of the legal proceedings was intense and unrelenting. Every hearing, every motion filing, every development was reported extensively on cable news and across social media platforms. Legal analysts debated the strength of the prosecution's case, unanimously agreeing it was overwhelming, and the defense's possible strategies, unanimously agreeing they had few good options. Public opinion polls showed that the vast majority of Americans supported the death penalty in this case, though a small minority opposed capital punishment on principle regardless of the crime. The prosecution also began preparing for the possibility that additional charges might be added. Federal terrorism statutes provided for various charges beyond simple assault or murder, including charges specifically related to attacking members of the armed forces. Prosecutors were reviewing whether charges under the Patriot Act or other counterterrorism legislation might be appropriate. These additional charges could potentially carry their own death penalty provisions and would strengthen the government's hand in any potential plea negotiations. Although both sides publicly stated their intention to proceed to trial, quiet discussions about a potential plea agreement were inevitable. The defense knew their client faced overwhelming evidence and near certain conviction. The prosecution knew that a plea to life without parole would guarantee punishment and spare the victims' families the trauma of a lengthy trial and appeals process. However, given the high-profile nature of the case and the public's demand for maximum punishment, any plea agreement seemed unlikely unless both victims survived, and even then, political pressure might make it impossible. The shooting of Specialist Sarah Beckstrom and Staff Sergeant Andrew Wolfe sent shockwaves through American society that extended far beyond the immediate horror of the crime itself. The attack occurred at a moment when the nation was already deeply divided over immigration policy, national security, and the legacy of America's withdrawal from Afghanistan. Lakanwal's crime became a political flashpoint that different factions seized upon to advance their existing agendas. President Donald Trump responded to the shooting by ordering the deployment of 500 additional National Guard troops to Washington, D.C. This decision served multiple purposes. It enhanced security in the Capitol. It demonstrated a strong response to what many viewed as a terrorism incident, and it sent a message that the administration would protect military personnel serving on domestic soil. For the National Guard community, the shooting represented a profound violation of trust and safety. Guard members sign up knowing they might be deployed to combat zones overseas or disaster areas domestically. They understand those risks, but being ambushed while standing guard in America's capital, just blocks from the White House, wasn't a scenario anyone had seriously considered as a realistic threat. The attack forced the Guard to reconsider security protocols for domestic deployments and to provide additional force protection training. The West Virginia National Guard, which lost 2 of its members to the attack, went into mourning even as both victims clung to life in intensive care. Guard leadership organized prayer vigils and support groups for unit members struggling with grief, anger, and survivor's guilt. Mental health counselors were made available to anyone in the unit who needed to process their trauma. The tight-knit nature of Guard units, where soldiers often serve together for years and know each other's families, meant that every member of the West Virginia Guard felt personally affected by the shooting. Within the Afghan-American community, particularly among refugees who had come to the United States through Operation Allies Welcome, the shooting created fear and anguish. These were people who had risked everything to escape Taliban rule, who had helped American forces at tremendous personal cost, and who were trying to build new lives in America. Now one of their own had committed an atrocity that threatened to paint the entire community with suspicion. Afghan-American organizations issued statements condemning the attack and emphasizing that Lakanwal's actions were not representative of the tens of thousands of Afghan refugees who posed no threat. The political debate over immigration and vetting procedures intensified dramatically. Conservative politicians and commentators pointed to the case as evidence that asylum and refugee programs were fundamentally flawed and dangerous. They called for more restrictive immigration policies, enhanced monitoring of refugee populations, and in some cases, suspension of refugee admissions from high-risk countries. Progressive politicians and advocates pushed back against what they viewed as exploitation of a tragedy to advance a xenophobic agenda. They argued that Lakanwal's radicalization appeared to have occurred after his asylum was granted, not before, making it nearly impossible for any screening process to predict. They pointed out that the vast majority of terrorism incidents in America were committed by native-born citizens, not refugees or asylum seekers. The families of Beckstrom and Wolfe found themselves thrust unwillingly into the national spotlight. Media outlets requested interviews constantly. Politicians wanted to meet with them to express support and solidarity. Well-meaning citizens sent letters, flowers, and donations. While the attention came from a place of genuine sympathy, it was also overwhelming for families trying to focus on their loved ones' recovery. Both families ultimately asked for privacy, releasing statements through military liaisons, thanking Americans for their support, but requesting space to deal with their trauma. The medical teams treating both victims at George Washington University Hospital worked around the clock to save their lives. The injuries from a .357 revolver at close range were severe. Massive internal damage, blood loss, shock, and the constant risk of infection or organ failure. Multiple surgeries were required to repair what could be repaired. Both patients remained sedated and on ventilators for days after the shooting. The doctor's updates to the families were cautiously optimistic, but filled with caveats about complications and the long recovery ahead. Law enforcement agencies across the country began reassessing security for National Guard deployments. If guardsmen could be targeted in Washington, D.C., could they be targeted elsewhere? Were there other radicalized individuals planning similar attacks? Should Guard members performing domestic missions be given enhanced force protection? These questions forced difficult conversations about balancing security with the Guard's community-oriented domestic mission. The political debate extended to questions about how America treats the allies who serve alongside its forces in war zones. Does America have a moral obligation to protect those who help its military? If so, what happens when bureaucratic delays or denials lead to tragedy? How many other former Afghan allies were watching Lakanwal's case and feeling their own bitterness toward the country they once helped? Veterans organizations weighed in on the case with strong emotions. Many veterans had served in Afghanistan and worked directly with Afghan partner forces. They had friendships with men like Lakanwal, relationships built in combat where they depended on each other for survival. The sense of betrayal they felt was profound. At the same time, some veterans advocated for continued support for Afghan refugees, arguing that one individual's criminal actions shouldn't condemn the thousands of faithful allies who remain loyal and grateful for American protection. The case became a touchstone in broader debates about terrorism and domestic security. Was this attack an example of foreign terrorism or domestic terrorism? Did it matter? What did it say about the effectiveness of counterterrorism vetting and monitoring? These questions had no easy answers, and different people reached very different conclusions based on their existing beliefs and political orientations. Educational institutions and policy organizations began studying the case to extract lessons for future refugee and asylum programs. What additional screening methods might have identified Lakanwal as a potential threat? Could regular check-ins or integration support have prevented his radicalization? Should mental health screening be more robust for refugees who have experienced combat trauma? These were complex questions requiring serious research and thoughtful policy development rather than knee-jerk reactions based on fear. The shooting also sparked renewed debate about gun control, though this aspect received less attention than the immigration dimensions. How had Lakanwal obtained a .357 revolver? Had he purchased it legally through a background check that he somehow passed? Or had he acquired it illegally through channels that existing gun laws couldn't prevent? Gun control advocates argued this showed the need for enhanced background checks and monitoring. Gun rights advocates argued that a determined criminal would always find ways to obtain weapons regardless of laws. Social media became a battleground for competing narratives about the case. Some users shared posts emphasizing Lakanwal's betrayal and calling for harsh punishment. Others shared posts about the service and sacrifice of Beckstrom and Wolfe. Still others used the case to argue for their preferred policies regarding immigration, counterterrorism, or military deployments. Misinformation spread rapidly. False claims about Lakanwal's background, fabricated quotes from officials, and distorted timelines that serve particular political narratives. Within the Department of Homeland Security and the State Department, the case prompted immediate reviews of screening procedures for asylum seekers and refugees. Officials reviewed Lakanwal's file to understand what had been known about him at various stages of the vetting process. They looked for missed red flags or procedural errors that might have prevented his admission or asylum approval. The tragedy raised philosophical questions about redemption, forgiveness, and the possibility of rehabilitation. Lakanwal had been someone who helped America and then someone who murdered Americans. Was his earlier service meaningful in any way when weighed against his later crimes? Should courts consider his prior Allied status as a mitigating factor, or did his betrayal make his crime even worse? Different people reach different conclusions based on their moral frameworks and beliefs about human nature. Faith communities across America grappled with how to respond to the shooting. Many held prayer services for the victims and their families. Some also prayed for Lakanwal's family, recognizing that his wife and 5 children were innocent victims who had lost their husband and father to his own evil choices. Religious leaders struggled to balance messages of justice and accountability with their tradition's teachings about mercy and forgiveness. The West Virginia community from which both victims came experienced collective trauma. Local news coverage was extensive and emotional. Residents organized fundraisers to support the victims' families with medical bills and other expenses. Schools held assemblies honoring the service and sacrifice of their hometown guardsmen. The tight-knit nature of communities in West Virginia meant that many people had personal connections to one or both victims, making the tragedy feel immediate and personal rather than abstract. As weeks passed and both victims remained in critical but stable condition, the nation's attention gradually shifted to other news stories. But for the families sitting vigil in hospital rooms, for the National Guard members processing their trauma, for the Afghan refugees worried about backlash, and for the investigators and prosecutors building their case, the aftermath of November 26, 2025 continued to shape their daily lives in profound ways. The case of Rahmanullah Lakanwal, former ally turned terrorist, refugee turned murderer, would be studied for years to come as America struggled with questions about immigration, terrorism, loyalty, and the complex legacy of its forever wars. The shooting had no easy lessons and no simple solutions. It was a tragedy that exposed fault lines in American society and forced uncomfortable conversations about policies that balanced security with humanitarian values. But ultimately, beyond all the politics and policy debates, the case came down to 2 young Americans who volunteered to serve their country and were shot down while doing exactly that. Whatever broader lessons might be learned, Specialist Sarah Beckstrom and Staff Sergeant Andrew Wolfe deserve to be remembered first and foremost as individuals who wore their nation's uniform with honor and paid a terrible price for that service. Don't forget to subscribe to Crazy Crime Lures for more up-to-date events in your vicinity.